Welcome to episode 55 of After the Breach podcast. We're your hosts, Monica, Jeff, and Sara, and we're here today to talk about something a little bit heavy, but it's a very important and timely message. As we've talked about in previous episodes, salmon are struggling, and in spite of ongoing efforts for recovery, things haven't been really going the way we'd hoped. Seals and sea lions eat salmon, but they also eat a bunch of other prey, as we talked about on our episode with Cindy Elliser from PacMam. Those same marine mammals are native parts of the ecosystem and the principal prey supporting the extraordinary population growth we're seeing in our Bigg's killer whales. However, recently, a new bill in Congress takes an overly simplistic ecological approach to managing their populations here in the Salish Sea. And today we're talking with Casey from SR3 about this bill and what the potential impacts are on pinnipeds and who knows what else. Well, thank you so much, Casey, for joining us for this very timely topic. And for our listeners, can you just introduce yourself, and you're with SR3? Maybe explain about SR3 as well.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. My name is Casey McLean. I'm the Executive Director and Veterinary Nurse for SR3, which stands for Sea Life Response, Rehabilitation, and Research. And we are the first and only marine mammal hospital in the entire Pacific Northwest. So that means that we only focus on marine mammals. That is our unique niche, I guess I'll say. And we can take all different kinds of marine mammals, we rehabilitate them and release them. And then we also do some pretty critical field research with southern residents and other whale and dolphin species.
And we wanted to ask you to join us today. This is an issue we've talked about a couple times on the podcast that sort of rears its ugly head every so often, it seems. But there's a new bill that has been proposed about culling pinnipeds in the state of Washington. And I don't know if you want to just tell us a little bit about what's the crux of this issue and what's sort of the history of this topic in the state of Washington.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. The other day I was speaking with a colleague and I learned that this has been an ongoing conversation for many, many years, which I was quite surprised about. And up until about 2018, the Democratic Party was very opposed to this, and then suddenly they started to see a bit of a switch. So this isn't a new issue. It's not something that's coming out of left field. It's been talked about a lot. The bills most recently that were proposed at the state level were not put through. They were not supported, and now we're starting to see this escalate to the federal level, which of course is much more concerning.
And so the belief behind these proposals are that pinnipeds, seals and sea lions, are somehow responsible for the depressed or declining salmon runs in the state. Is that right?
Absolutely. I think it's, so much misinformation out there. And of course, all of us sitting here, and I think many of your listeners know what the true issues are for salmon. However, those are big issues, and people are feeling really challenged to address those issues. And so they're seeing this animal that is eating fish out in the wild, and they're saying, okay, well, I can just get rid of that, and that will make my life easier. And
we can talk a little bit about the complexities of why that's not the case, but maybe first we can summarize this new bill, HR 9621, which was introduced earlier this month by Washington State Representative Michael Baumgardner of the 6th District and co-sponsored by Emily Randall of the 6th District. This is proposing an amendment to the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Can you describe sort of what this bill would encompass if it were to go through?
Yeah, so what this bill is going to do is take what they have been doing at Bonneville Dam since, I want to say 2008, which they have been removing sea lions at the dam during that time frame, however many years that is, quite a few. And this is going to expand that throughout the entire Salish Sea. So all of Washington waters will now be ground for removing or killing of seals and sea lions. This could lead to a pretty indiscriminate cull. It would include 3 different species: harbor seals, California sea lions, and stellar sea lions. And that truly is unprecedented for the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And then the other parts of it that we're concerned about is it does eliminate the requirement that euthanasia be humane, meaning that does not have to be chemical. It can lead to things like shooting them, which in the past 9 months, we've had 3 different cases of gunshot animals show up alive and suffering. So I do not That's a very scary thing to think about if they're now going to start shooting these large animals that are in the water that are very challenging to make sure that they are getting a direct shot of. There's no monitoring plan that goes along with this. There's no funds that go along with it. So even though the bill does have a good part of talking about creating a technology accelerator, it talks about creating that within NOAA. And as we all know, recent cuts to NOAA have been dramatic, and there's no appropriations tied to it. So there's a lot of very concerning language in this bill.
One of the big concerns that I have just in reading the bill and reading about this, and we've talked about this on the podcast so many times, that we have this incredibly growing population of killer whales, and their primary prey are harbor seals and other pinnipeds. And it seems like nowhere in this approach is it even mentioned that the species that they're looking at authorizing these culls are primary prey for a growing population, and that it is a very simplistic and one-sided approach to this. And nowhere are the dietary requirements, the growing dietary requirements of the big killer whales factored in here at all. And I don't even know if the people that are making these decisions are even aware of anything about killer whales.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. That's a very concerning factor in this bill as well. And the fact that those are now the only killer whales that can be watched by this whale watching industry that our economy needs and relies upon. So I think that's a very double-edged sword that nobody's really paying attention to or talking about, like you said, Jeff.
This just sounds like a PR nightmare to me.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
mm-hmm.
What would this look like in reality for potentially this great quantity of seals and sea lions to be killed in the state? Like, I just can't imagine that the public would sign off on that when we're, whether we're thinking from like an ecological perspective or an animal welfare perspective. It just seems like a brutal image that the media could run with on this one.
I do agree with you, Monica. I don't think the public would sign off on this. I'm just not sure that the public is going to get the opportunity to vote per se. However, we all have our voices and we can use that to write into our legislators, of course. The other part that's concerning, you sort of mentioned this, is thousands of animals being killed. Well, it does say in the bill that they're capping to 10% of potential biological removal. And while, yes, that is thousands of animals, the other point to this is that stocks have not been assessed. Some of them in the past 20 years have not been assessed. The only program that NOAA had that counted California sea lions and assessed their population was shut down last year. So what is the plan for monitoring? How is this considered, adaptive management when there is no monitoring plan, no ability to change what we're doing? That's really scary.
That fact has been wild to me, having followed this issue for the last decade or more, that we're doing this finger pointing to the pinnipeds as being, these voracious salmon predators. And there is some science that backs up a piece of that we can talk about a little bit, but we don't even have a handle of how many seals and sea lions are in Washington Salish sea waters. Like you said, the surveys are outdated. They're not even occurring that regularly. There's not like current published numbers out there. So how can we come up with what is a sustainable removal, or how can we fully monitor what impact the growing Bigg's killer whale population might already be having on pinniped numbers here?
Well, and also don't forget we have 3 genetically distinct stocks. Who's going to be monitoring to make sure that we're going to continue to have good genetic diversity and not create a bottleneck? They haven't even had genetic assessments since, I think it was in the 90s sometimes when they did that research. So yes, lots of very concerning aspects of this.
Yeah, so we don't have assessments on the population. We don't have assessments on the growing dietary needs of the Bigg's killer whales, yet we're poised to act. It chills me to my core that if this is how government addresses problems in all facets of our life, this is not a good direction for our democracy in the big picture, let alone this issue.
Yeah. And, there's some really good science that just came out of the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, actually, that talked about the problems with some of these papers that are often quoted as reasons we should be culling. Chasco being one of those papers. So not to get too far into the weeds of the heavy science, but there were a lot of assumptions made in that paper, and they specifically call out how it's wrong. They also call out how often in these policy discussions, the range of how much these animals, regardless of what pinniped species you're talking about, could be from like 7% to 31%, for example, and they'll quote the 31%. So we don't even know the true impact this may have. We may see no salmon recovery. There was also a quote recently by the Washington salmon recovery manager that said, if there's more salmon, we will absolutely eat more of them. And the real predator that any extra salmon would be going to would be humans. If that is true, then how is this really about ecosystem restoration?
Yeah,
Fair point.
That's a really good point. I think it's important to put into context for folks where this comes from a scientific perspective and where it starts to deviate from the science. So we know from the last pinniped numbers that we do have that the populations are very healthy in Washington's inland waters. They're, as of the late 1990s, at least, they were considered kind of at or above, pre-bounty numbers from, when we used to cull pinnipeds in the state, that they had recovered and were doing quite well. And so the concern relative to declining salmon stocks in Western Washington is that this great number of seals and sea lions will be eating a huge number of salmon, both juvenile out-migrating salmon smolts and adult salmon that are returning. And there's some truth to this. You mentioned some of the papers that have been referenced looking at seal diets and such, but it's a very complicated issue because these are generalist predators. So they are eating salmon sometimes and in some places, but they're also eating a whole wide variety of other prey, including some other species that also eat salmon, such as Pacific hake. So you pull a string on a food web, and humanity doesn't have a very good track record of doing that. You don't really know what all the unintended consequences of that might be. And so I think it's accurate to say that pinnipeds are eating salmon in the state, and that's one of the factors that impacts how many salmon there are. But there are so many other factors that are coming into play here. For example, even the culling that is occurring now, you mentioned like on the Columbia River where we have sea lions at dams and that sort of things. We have created these like human choke points where these animals congregate because there are structures like dams that make it possible for them to do that. And then they're eating a bunch of fish there, which is true. But if we remove those animals, there's other animals that will just come in and take their place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you even took out huge numbers of seals and sea lions, you still aren't going to recover the salmon if you don't address the real issues. And those are big issues to address, and they're really difficult. And to your point, we don't even know how additive seal and sea lion predation is. They could be eating fish that would be eaten by another predator, like you mentioned. We've also learned that the pinks are being overproduced outside of our country. And when those guys are released, and that is a cyclical return of every 2 years, when they're available, seals and sea lions eat more of them. Well, pinks also eat other salmon. So now if we have more pink abundance and less seals and sea lions, we could actually see our salmon numbers of the salmon that we want go down with killing off seals and sea lions. So I think that's a really important thing to mention. The other thing that I just recently read about from Wild Fish Conservancy, talking about how the ocean fishing impacts have been grossly underestimated for 2 decades. Not 2 months, not 2 years, 2 decades. And those are the numbers that we're basing how much fishing can be done in the state on. So there's so many bigger issues than just what are these seals and sea lions eating. And there's also new research and new research methods coming out to better understand that as well.
So it is a distraction from what you called as being like the real issue, which I think is human caused, right? We like to point the finger at other species when we can, because I think it's difficult to change our own behavior in that respect. And you touched on one of them, the mixed stock fisheries and how many fish are really being taken and are these really sustainable fisheries is another topic that that can and probably should be its own podcast episode. So that's one of the real issues. But what else are we talking about as some of the real issues when it comes to salmon recovery?
I mean, I think habitat restoration. I was just at a salmon presentation the other night, and someone from Long Live the Kings mentioned how at the Ship Canal bridge where the salmon are coming through, the water is over 50% of the time at lethal temperatures when the salmon are returning. So they're having pre-spawn mortality. They're also forcing the fish, those temperatures are forcing the fish to turn back into salt water that might be a little bit cooler on the other side, which is forcing them back where more predators are before they can even spawn. So those sorts of things, and that has been on the state's knowledge and on the docket, I guess, for addressing for many years. They're aware of the issue. It just, there hasn't been funding or time to deal with it, I guess. There's also things, obviously, like there's probably plenty of dams that may be able to come down versus some of the other dams that could not, and, more easily, I guess I would say. And things like, let's not talk about putting a dam in on the Chehalis River. Like, if salmon are really that important to the state, why would we even consider another dam on the last free-flowing river where Chinook are? That doesn't make sense to me if this really is a priority issue. So, toxins in the water from the tires we've talked about, I'm sure everybody's aware. And these are long-term things that are very difficult to address, and legislators will say they feel like they're stuck, that these issues are going to take a lot of time that they feel they don't have in order to address this problem. And of course, the things that are happening outside of our country or in open ocean, we have no control over that.
So as we talk about this bill that could potentially lead into another cull, I think it's important for a lot of our listeners may not be aware that there was a very significant cull on pinnipeds prior to the Marine Mammal Protection Act coming into play in 1972. And from what I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, we didn't see any benefit to salmon after that cull.
So here's a little history that kind of blew my mind, I guess. Salmon declines begin in the 1860s and 1870s. They were formally documented in the 1890s, and then it reached crisis level in 1991 when they listed them as an ESA species. We've had since 1991 to try and address this. I also find it very interesting that I don't know anywhere else in the world where you still eat and commercially fish an endangered species. So some of the information, when salmon were formally documented as declining, there was, let me see, what is this? I want to try and get this right for you guys so you have it as it's corrected in here. So they collapsed for over a century ago. They had some of the highest and best fishing numbers when pinnipeds were and other marine mammals were protected after the MMPA was enacted. Of course, there wasn't a lot of research going on at that time, or in-depth research, I would assume, to know exactly why that happened. But yeah, there was a report that some of the best catches of coho, chinook, and steelhead along the U.S. West Coast occurred after marine mammals and many birds were fully protected by law. So I found that quite interesting as well.
It kind of makes sense. I mean, you think back thousands of years, there were salmon and whales and pinnipeds and indigenous cultures of humans all coexisting just fine here. And the issues really started after European contact. So if you take the big picture, historic perspective, it's pretty clear what the deciding factor is to what we're dealing with. But again, it's difficult issues to address. And so for some of us, this bill, the pros and cons of this bill seem obvious, but it is gaining a lot of traction and a lot of support, and maybe including from some unexpected sources. So can you tell us a little bit about who's kind of in favor and against this bill that you know of at this point?
Most of the science organizations I talk to recognize that this is an incredibly slippery slope when you start amending the Marine Mammal Protection Act, especially in light of what we just saw with the Endangered Species Act. That was very scary, of changing the definition of the term harm. So from my perspective, all of the science groups I have been in touch with have said this is not something that they support or feel would solve the issue. I think there's a lot of potentially others out there that maybe spend a lot of time on the water or fishing that are in support of this because they don't see other options. And I think there are other options. There's even some technology out there that is working that is not being invested in by the government and trialed out to see if it could work before we go through with drastic measures like removing a top predator from an ecosystem that we understand so very little about.
Can you talk about what sort of technology you're referring to?
Yeah, it's the task startle system that has been used. I believe it's there's a couple different companies that make it, but they've employed it at the Hood Canal Bridge. They've employed it in Bellingham Creek, I believe it was, and at Ballard Lock. So while these technologies are not perfect, they're not going to stop all predation, and nor should we. This is a natural thing. They will help. And I would be very interested to see, would they help just as much as what removing up to 10% of the biological removal would do? I will also say, though, that I would venture to guess we probably have been removing up to the potential biological removal already from things like the gunshots we already see, the dead bodies that we're recovering and tracking, entanglements, cancers that we're seeing in these animals. So I think we have to remember that the threats of yesteryear, which might have been hunting directly and hunting too much, are long gone. However, we have all of these new threats, whether that's starvation because there's not enough food. We see that with the unusual mortality events in California. Again, like I mentioned, we're seeing cancers in these animals. We're seeing toxins build up in their body. We're seeing parasites overtake them and entanglements and both hits. So I think there's a lot of new threats that these animals didn't used to face.
I think you have kind of a unique perspective working in the rehab and rescue side of things. Have you seen any patterns in, more patients coming in or new diagnoses popping up compared to maybe what we thought pinnipeds were dealing with here historically?
Yeah, we're certainly seeing more human interaction cases, and I think that's because a lot of the areas where these animals used to have to rest and haul out are just populated at this point. We're kind of expanding everywhere, and these animals are losing the space that they once had before. As far as diseases, we are seeing more gunshot wounds, as I mentioned. We are seeing some other interesting cases, mainly parasite related. But our waters are warming, and parasites love warm water. So we're certainly seeing some increasing trends there. Avian influenza was seen in Washington just a few years ago, and we've never had that before. So I think if you talk about this as adaptive management, what will happen if we suddenly have an unusual mortality outbreak? What then? How will it be stopped to make sure that we aren't taking too many out of the ecosystem? And people forget, too, that California sea lions, again, like we said before, are coast-wide. What we do here in Washington is not just impacting Washington. It's impacting the entire coastal ecosystem.
I feel like that's true of so many species, though, and we don't really think about it because as humans, we like to place borders on things and labels on things and put them in neat little boxes, and the natural world just doesn't work like that. Everything's connected.
Yeah, which is what makes this issue so incredibly challenging, as you guys had mentioned. I will say there was also a NOAA status review not too terribly long ago that ranked the threat to Olympic Peninsula steelhead, and it actually scored pinnipeds not even in the top 3. So they were the lowest ranked threat category, honestly. So climate change, inadequate regulation, and overutilization and harvest all ranked well above pinniped predation. So my biggest fear with this is that people see it as the smoking gun, that this will fix all of my problems. And with the recent changes to the ESA, I'm concerned that we might start seeing less money going to habitat restoration. If by destroying habitat that is no longer harm, why would we continue to invest money into it from the federal side of things? So I'm certainly concerned about what that could cause as well.
So it seems like the people and organizations that are based in science and the more complicated view of how things work are opposed to this bill. Where's the big support coming from? Where's the big push? And how did this end up getting pushed into the federal domain? And what do you think the chances are of this actually going through?
Really good questions. far outside of my scope of understanding, honestly, of how did it wind up at the federal level. I mean, I think rightfully so. People are concerned about salmon recovery. We are too. SR3 is a pro-salmon organization. We work on killer whales. We fully recognize that we need salmon from an ecological perspective, obviously, but an economy and cultural perspective as well. So I'm assuming it just got pushed up because of the subject matter. Honestly, other than that, I'm not sure. But I would assume that most of the support is coming from fishermen of all kinds, of all walks of life, and all over the country, potentially.
So you mentioned the recent NOAA report that ranked some of the risk factors to salmon. There was also a Washington Academy of Sciences report a few years back that looked at this topic. But it sounds like potentially these, supposedly scientific agencies, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and NOAA Fisheries, might actually be coming down in support of this bill.
Yes, which is very disappointing considering the science points directly opposite of that. But, even in the Washington Academy of Sciences paper that you referred to, I mean, there's a statement in there. Pinnipeds are likely not the primary cause of salmon population recovery issues. I think taking the setting or the statement of, oh, well, we should just try something. Well, why is this the thing that we should just try when it has the potential to have such negative consequences? Shouldn't we just try investing more money in habitat restoration and investing money in technology? Maybe that's the thing we should try instead of removing animals from the ecosystem.
Absolutely. So these government organizations are, not immune to political influences, and I suspect that's what's, driving this in this case. We're recording this on July 20th, and the first hearing of the bill in the subcommittee is tomorrow, but this is probably going to go on for some length of time. So can you summarize for folks sort of where we are in the process and what's coming up next as far as we know?
Yeah, oh gosh, I won't pretend to be an expert on this, but from my understanding, what will happen is this is strictly just a hearing for them to hear the bills, and they're hearing several bills, honestly, at this reading. What will happen after that is that it may stay within the House and be marked up. It would then be sent to the Senate, or it would go through a House floor vote. It would be sent to the Senate. They would then hear it, mark it up, send it back to the House, and then there would be voted on again, both in those House and Senate. So it does have a long road ahead of it. This is not a one and done. However, like you mentioned, we don't foresee this going away anytime soon.
So if listeners are concerned about this and want to make their opinions on this bill known, what are the best ways for people to participate and share their comments, and who should they be reaching out to?
Yeah, I think right now the best folks to reach out to are the sponsor and the co-sponsor of the bill, as you mentioned, Baumgartner and Randall, and then your own federal representatives, because you're a constituent and they need to hear from you and they need to hear your opinion, regardless of what your opinion is. Make sure your voice is heard. That's how we all want this to work, right? And there are some templates out there, letters you can use, but the most effective thing really is to write in your own voice and share just directly from, what you know and what you're feeling about this bill.
Mm-hmm. So certainly if you're a constituent of Baumgartner and Randall in Washington State, your input would mean a lot. This Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries Subcommittee has representatives from multiple states. I know we have a lot of listeners from across the country, and there are representatives, I looked this up specifically for this, from Mississippi, Virginia, California, Michigan, Florida, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, North Carolina, Montana, and American Samoa on the committee. So potentially one of your representatives is directly involved in the committee hearing this bill, even if you do not live in the Salish Sea region. So it's worth doing a little bit of research and seeing, whose table is this coming across first, and is there somebody you can reach out to?
And we can put that in the show notes.
Yeah. One thing I didn't mention that just came to mind is I would love to know, what's the plan if this goes into place and it doesn't work, or when it doesn't work? How do we restore that? Are we going back to what we were doing in the 60s and trying to start from scratch again? I think it's definitely something worth the public can reach out and ask those questions
Well, that was one of the most glaring things in the language of this bill, or lack of language in this bill, is it really doesn't have any safeguards in place or metrics for how do we determine if this is effective? What do we do if it is not effective? It seems almost just like a blank permission slip to go out and start killing pinnipeds with very little oversight.
Well, and what's the measure of success? Is it 50 more fish, 500,000 more fish? What's the measure of success? So if it only gains us 100 more fish, was that worth killing thousands of animals? Does that make it cost effective to do that? I think there's just so little definition. Well, we've seen this over and over with these proposed bills. No one's ever been able to actually put the parameters on what does success look like. And if you can't say what it looks like, how do we know when we've got it, when we've arrived?
I think too, it's important when people do who are opposed reach out to their representatives to mention the dietary requirements of the growing big killer whale population, and that's not being addressed or even acknowledged. Forget about addressed; it's not even being mentioned or acknowledged in any of these conversations, in any of the material that I saw with the bill.
And to me, it just comes back to we don't have the data to even make an assessment of, how many pinnipeds would we have to remove? What would the impacts of that be? If we don't even know how many pinnipeds there are or how many are being eaten by Bigg's killer whales, there's just not the scientific support that this would work. And I definitely understand the sentiment that we need to try something because this is a very urgent issue. But I totally agree with you, Casey, that why is this the thing at the top of our list to try when there are many other options on the table that have a much higher confidence level of actually succeeding?
Well, and I know even at Bonneville Dam, when they've removed animals, they've removed far less than they actually were permitted to do. And some of that came from the scientists being very specific about we're not going to remove animals if it's not going to actually have a benefit or have an impact. So it's interesting to me that if that's the internal sentiment and that's the scientific assessment of this, why would it make sense to then expand it and do the opposite in all the other areas of the Sailor Sea?
Anything else that either you guys would like to ask or Casey that you would like to share with our listeners on this topic?
I don't think so. I will absolutely, Monica, and I can send it to whoever would like it on your end, send you some other notes regarding scientific studies and some of those data points I'm talking about. That way, if you want to include that in show notes, you can.
That would be great.
And if there's a reference letter that folks could look at too, I think that's helpful to work off of as you write your own letters.
Mm-hmm. No, I certainly appreciate your willingness to talk about this. I think it needs to be a bigger conversation. I certainly hope that the public will get involved and reach out if they have questions. It's something I'm very open to engaging on with different perspectives as well. I think we all need to come to the table because we all truly have the same goal. We all want more salmon. And it might be for different reasons, but we all want more salmon. We know it's needed. So let's figure out what's actually going to get us there rather than being distracted by something that's going to potentially make it worse or just waste our time and money on something that's ineffective.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Casey, so much for joining us for a very heavy topic, but a very timely one.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, I'm not feeling optimistic.
Because you think this bill is going to pass?
I do. I worry about it passing. I don't know, post-process of if it passes, if there's some other process before it gets implemented. I don't really know about that. My big concern is, it's two things. There's so much of this. It's bad. It's a bad look for the state. I don't see how the state can defend this position of going out there and doing mass culls. I think that a big piece of this that's missing is any kind of data on the dietary requirements of the Biggs. I think it would be really helpful if we had that, if it was included, and if they even, I highly doubt that any of the people voting on this even know what a Bigg's killer whale is, or anything about their history or how they're thriving because of the pinniped population in not just in the Sailor Sea, but beyond. But this conversation got me thinking, so what if there is salmon recovery from whatever strings we pull, and down the road there are 150 or 200 southern resident killer whales that some interests deem are eating too much salmon. Are we going to start talking about a cull on southern residents? I mean, what slippery slope, right? I mean, it's like what?
You're getting about 1,000 steps ahead.
No, I get that, but my mind couldn't help going there
no.
of what's the difference? We're talking about slippery slope here. It's like, well, how much more salmon will we have without the southern residents? And it's like, this opens the door to start having more insane conversations.
Well, conspiracy theory mind, does ask sometimes why the southern residents aren't more at the forefront of the federal and the state story. And some people have suggested that it would be much easier for salmon recovery, and by that I really mean fisheries and the promotion of fisheries, if the southern residents either weren't here or weren't cared about. So I get where you're coming from. There is a little bit of truth to that there's a lot of political sway at play that's behind closed doors, and sometimes, or usually, I guess, unpleasant to think about. But I'm not used to being the optimist in the room. I prefer to think of myself as a realist. But this bill was only introduced, less than 2 weeks ago. It's got a long road ahead of it. And I just don't think that once the public gets wind of what this would actually look like, that it is something people would sign off on. Like, I know people want salmon recovery, and like Casey said, we all want salmon recovery, but this would just be brutal. And I just can't even imagine what it would look like in reality, let alone, what the media images might look like. Like, I just can't see this gaining traction to the finish line.
I hope you're right. I would love to join your optimism, but I am very concerned. I agree. I don't see how the public would sign on to this. I think the public would be very adamantly opposed, at least segments of the public. I just don't know in today's political climate or political setup of what government is doing. I don't know that is going to be a factor.
I think it's okay to be concerned and also optimistic. I'm not trying to play both sides here, but it's important to stay engaged with these, but also to not lose the hope that this is going to go the way we hope it goes.
Well, for sure.
You have to.
Yeah,
right?
For sure. If we want it to go the way we'd like it to go, that's going to be because of the public engagement in the issue. We can't just, sit back and say this isn't a problem. But, like I said, there are state representatives from across the country that are hearing this bill. Some of them are probably up for re-election soon. So even when, things at the federal level are not going the way of science and protecting wildlife and biodiversity, there are still, more local strings to pull where people might listen to their constituents if there's enough of an outcry when it might affect them at the ballot box.
Yeah.
I think this is as optimistic as I can get here.
Let's hear it.
And it's a little bit longer term thinking. Let's say this bill does not go through. It is definitely and certainly not going to be the last push for pinniped culls. And I think that what is needed to help block the long-term push for pinniped culls is more understanding, more PR, more science around the culling program that nature has in place with the Bigg's killer whales. And I think the more that is understood, known, supported, and put out there in PR and in science, the easier it will be moving forward to shut these things down, where we have this perfect culling program in place that requires zero tax dollars, zero interaction on our part, and over time will work.
Effective, yes. They may not meet the humane requirement either.
This is definitely true, but they're getting rid of that in this bill anyway. So,
yes. But I do think you make a really good point. That's something that we can and should be advocating for within the state of Washington, is that some of the science that we're missing, some of this data that we're missing, is something that should be funded and should be produced. Like, why is WDFW not doing extensive pinniped surveys and publishing that data? Like, there's no reason, if this is such a hot topic issue, that we should not have those numbers.
Right.
And I'm sure it comes down to personnel and funding and all of that. But those are things that, if you live in Washington, your elected officials at the state legislature should hear about, the governor should hear about, that those are things that we think should be a priority.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we get a bill out there to require studies like this?
That's way beyond my realm of knowledge.
And mine, but maybe somebody knows.
Somebody listening might know.
Yeah. And how do we, a bill that requires the study of, census on pinnipeds and an examination of the dietary requirements of the growing big killer whale population.
I will say we are working on that question at the Orca Behavior Institute. So we put out the paper previously that was modeling like estimated prey consumption, making a lot of assumptions on what percentage of diet is harbor seals and things of that sort. And we are looking to update that based on our real world observations. And from the preliminary data, they're eating a lot more harbor seals here than they are potentially elsewhere in their range and than we thought. So hopefully, that's probably a next year publication, but the hope is that we can update that previous study with more real world context to provide the killer whale side of the equation. But we definitely still need the pinniped side of the equation of how many are there and what's their population trend really doing.
I love that you're working on that. I can't wait.
Because she's the best.
She is the best.
I'm melting into the floor now. Thank you.
So we'll post a bunch of stuff in the show notes. Definitely encourage people to contact legislators with your thoughts, and that's going to be hopefully effective if enough people can do that. And I'm hoping that a lot of our listeners are moved to reach out.
And beyond that, just keep talking about this issue. Like, bring it up. Like, when it is, well, maybe not like just cold call. Like,
cold call somebody on the beach.
Calls. Yeah.
Just walk up to somebody on the beach.
But I mean, it is an important topic, and it goes beyond just contacting your legislators. Like, this needs to be spread, and
there just needs to be public awareness.
Yeah. So that's just talking to people. Our forte.
Stay safe out there.